Hi there, I'm Pastor James, and welcome back to the cabin. You're joining me in a rather scary time because, being the colder weather, the air tends to be uninhabitable for the spiders, and it sends them in. So I'm kind of a little apprehensive about doing this. I have a terrible fear of spiders, and some of you will know this, others won't. But yeah, I hope you will pay attention and listen to the message rather than scan my surroundings to see if one is creeping up on me. We'll have to see how we go. But if I suddenly yelp like a little girl, then you'll know what's happened. I'm going to try not to be distracted, and I'm going to focus on what I want to share because this is a really good message. And I mentioned last time we're going to go through a series in Peter, 1 Peter. It's a letter to Christians in a very difficult time, and I think that for our time that we're living in, it's a really good message because it shows us a lot of the stuff in this letter, this epistle, how to cope with trials and suffering. And although in our country we don't tend to face persecution on the level that they were in those times, or even in other countries where Christians are severely persecuted, we face a different kind of suffering and situations that we struggle with. Then it's not worth comparing to what other Christians face, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own struggles. And 1 Peter addresses a lot of this stuff. I spoke about getting to know Peter, the author of this little book, last time, and I just want to briefly go over that again because it gives us a bit of a context of the person who penned this. He was a fisherman when Jesus came to know him. His father's name was Jonah, which is quite ironic given the story of the prophet Jonah. And he was a guy, Peter, who took one step forward and one step back. He walked on water and fell in the water. He was somebody who proclaimed who Jesus was, the only one out of the disciples that did, and then was later rebuked by Jesus. He was addressed by Jesus as Satan, even though he wasn't calling Peter Satan. It was Satan using Peter to tell Jesus not to face the death and resurrection. So he was a bit of a coming forwards, going back kind of guy. And of course, there's also the well-known aspect where Peter said to Jesus that he would stay by his side the whole time when he was going to face the trial of his death. And he said, "No, Lord, I'm going to be with you." And yet we know later on that he denied him 3 times publicly. So I have a lot of sympathy with him. Not that that was something that a lot of Christians get to do because they don't have that time with Jesus. But I have sympathy with him in that, there are times in my life where I take steps forward in my walk with the Lord, and I feel like everything's good and strong, and then the next moment I will have taken a big step back because I've fallen yet again. That's the Christian life, and if you struggle in this way, then take heart, because the Lord reinstated Peter just by having a chat with him on the beach. So 1 Peter is written at a time for Christians who are facing severe persecution, severe in an extreme way. So Emperor Nero in 64 AD, it's believed to be on July 19th, there was this big fire in Rome, and it was rumoured that Nero was responsible for setting off this fire because he had big plans to restructure Rome. But of course Nero didn't want that. He didn't want to be tarnished with that, so he blamed the Christians, and the Christians were then persecuted very heavily in some rather gruesome and graphic ways. If you want to know more about what happened to the Christians at that time, then I encourage you to look it up. But it's not easy reading. They really did suffer. So it's a difficult time for believers, and they were dispersed, and they were in exile. And that is where we find our letter opening. I'm going to read the introduction to you, because that's what this message is going to be, an introduction. And it says, 1 Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. Now, there are times when I come across the letters in the New Testament, and they have this introduction, as every letter should have an introduction, introducing the person who's writing it. But I have a tendency to think, well, I just want to skip the introduction because I want to get to the meat of the message and hear what's being said. But if you actually look at this introduction, there's an awful lot in here, in these 2 verses that we're looking at. And for me to unpack it, I think I want to keep this as concise as I can. But I was even struggling on Sunday when I shared this sermon to keep it to my usual length. There was so much more that I could have said. And so what do we take from this? What do we see from this this introduction to 1 Peter? Well, firstly, we see that he addresses them as elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces. And it's because of this terrible shockwave of persecution, but also because Christians were persecuted ever since Jesus was raised from the dead. It wasn't a new thing. They were hunted and hated, and so they were scattered. But also the news was spreading out into different areas as well. And the areas that he lists, these provinces, are what we would consider to be modern-day Turkey. And it's really interesting if you were to ever see a map. I wish I had the technological know-how to put a map up on the screen. I'll get there in the end. But if you were to see them, then these areas are really spread out across what we consider to be modern-day Turkey. So it really shows, just by looking at that, how far and wide they spread. But to call them exiles, the New King James Version refers to them as pilgrims. So people are on a pilgrimage, they're on a journey. And I really believe that this is something which we can relate to as Christians, because our home is not this life. This planet is not our home. It is heaven. That's where our citizenship lies. And we need to keep that in mind, because otherwise we can get too comfortable in this life, thinking that we need to make ourselves as safe and as comfortable and as possible. And I think that to see life in that way means we take our gaze off of our ultimate home, our eternal home in heaven. And you can go the other way too far as well. You can see that you can have, so heavenly minded you have no earthly good. There's that phrase there. So you can think of heaven all the time, and that means that I'm just waiting for my time to come. I'm not really going to do much in this life because it's all about heaven. We need a balance. We need to get that common ground balance there. So the people reading this book, they would have seen all sorts of different topics coming up. It talks about how we need to submit to authorities in every area of institution, as it says in 1 Peter. It talks about how we are to be with each other, how we are to love each other, how we are to face suffering, what kind of people ought we be if we are facing this kind of suffering. And I've heard it said that if we are going to be prepared for the end times, now I believe the end times started when Jesus ascended. If we are to be prepared for the end times, some have said that we need to go into Revelation. We need to mine it. We need to understand it, because we won't be ready, and there'll be things that will surprise us, and we won't know how to behave or what choices to make. But I think that all we need for our time at the moment is to be prepared in our walk with the Lord. So we need to be constantly tapping into that relationship, praying to God, reading his word. That is the preparedness that we need. And 1 Peter really highlights this. It goes into say about what kind of people ought you be. And we will come to that. But I think 1 Peter is a really good book to study so that we will be prepared. And this is what he's doing when he's writing this letter. I believe it was dictated to somebody else, but these are his words. And he's preparing Christians for the persecution that's coming and has already come. And he wants them to know how to deal with it. Not to get out of it, not to run away from it, but to face it and how to face it. We don't suffer persecution on this scale in our country, but we can so easily lose sight of the fact that there are Christians who do. Their life is in turmoil and they live in fear of their lives. And I find it slightly ironic that this message is something that I'm preaching around the time of Halloween, where it's fun to be scared, it's fun to be frightened, but actually real fear is about the real world and the real threat to our lives that as Christians we can face. That is not fun at all. There is nothing glamorous or fun about that. So we need to make sure that we are focused, that we are disciplined, that we are not living for ourselves but living for God. And I think 1 Peter really points out to us the tools that we need to get through. So just moving on now, there is this highlighted in verse 2. When he's addressing the Christians, he says that they have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God, the Father, which means God knew who was going to take up the call to follow him. It was his foreknowledge. But it was through the sanctifying work of the Spirit. There is no one who can earn their place with God. There's no one who can be good enough to follow the Lord. We are all flawed and fallible. Peter himself being a very good example of this. And it's also not only for the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit, or through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, it's to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. It's about obedience. The Christian life is about obedience. We must be disciplined and obedient to Jesus. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think if there are any believers out there that think that I've got my ticket to heaven, my citizenship's in heaven, which means this life is a bit of a, it's a blink of an eye, it's a drop in the ocean. I'm not going to be here for long. I may as well enjoy myself. The rest of the world seems to be able to do whatever it wants. They're not getting lightning bolts for it. So where's the harm? God will forgive me. I can just keep going as I am, and I'm going to be happy, because at the end of the day, that's what matters, isn't it? Now, these aren't my thoughts. These are the thoughts of some people I've come across in my life. And you may know people like this too. That they can see themselves as somebody who's going to heaven, and therefore they need not worry about sin. That's no longer a problem for them. Jesus has paid for it on the cross. He'll just forgive them when it comes to getting to meet him in person. But it's not the life that we are to live. We are to live in obedience. Whatever Jesus said in his word, we need to live like that. We need to love our enemies. If you ever consider how hard that is it even easy? Is it even possible to love somebody you don't even like? That's a challenging message. And I'm not saying that I have accomplished this in every area of my life, but it's something that God is working on in me. And if you allow him, he will do the same for you. So it's about obedience to Jesus Christ. Because of his grace, and it says grace and peace be yours in abundance. So we do have a guarantee. If we're a true believer, you have a guarantee to live with him in heaven, but that doesn't mean you have a license to live your way. We must live God's way. So we're going to come through this book section by section, and there are a lot of sections. There's only 5 chapters. So the theory is it shouldn't take long to get through it, but there is so much in this letter. So I'm hoping that we will explore this together, and some of it's very challenging, some of it's quite hard hitting, but some of it's really good stuff as well. Well, it's all good stuff, but some of it is quite uplifting and challenging in a good way. So I'm looking forward to doing this, and I hope you'll join me on this journey. And I think I'm safe in saying that I've not seen any of the aforementioned spiders, but yeah, there have been a few around here, and I've had to deal with them. All God's creation, but not one that I'm particularly fond of. But hopefully next time you'll join me, and we'll work through our first section in our first chapter. So I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.